Dear viewers, today we study experiments of diffusion. Introduction. Diffusion is an important chemical and physical phenomenon that has a bearing on our daily lives. Diffusion of gases and other molecules across membranes in our bodies allows many biological processes to occur and thus keeps us alive by providing oxygen and energy sources to our cells. Paint dries because water or a solvent can diffuse to the surface and evaporate. Diffusion is one of the ways in which molecules move across large distances. Molecules can also move in other ways, such as when a mechanical fan is used to draw fresh air into a room. Perhaps one of the most interesting uses of diffusion is the enhancement of the color of gemstones such as rubies and sapphire. Diffusion. Diffusion means to spread, to extend in all directions, to disperse. According to the concept of molecular motion, that is kinetic theory, the elementary particles are in constant motion at temperatures above the absolute zero. This results in the spread of a substance from its more abundant place to a region of less abundant place by the physical process known as diffusion. More refinery, the movement of gases, liquids or solids, that is molecules, atoms or ions from a point of its higher concentration to a point of its lower concentration in order to get evenly distributed throughout the available space because of their kinetic motion is defined as diffusion. When substances are brought in contact with each other, they intermix. This property is known as diffusion. This property of diffusion takes place very rapidly in case of gases and to a lesser extent in case of liquids, whereas solids do not show this process of diffusion with each other. But what we can observe in case of solids is that the diffusion of solids in liquids takes place at very slow rate. If a solid is kept in contact with an excess of solvent in which it is soluble, some portion of the solid gets dissolved. We know that this process is known as dissolution of solid particles into liquid, which takes place due to diffusion of solid particles into the liquid. Rate of diffusion depends upon temperature. As temperature increases, the kinetic energy of particle increases, so the speed of particles also increases, which thus increases the rate of diffusion. Size of particle. As the size of particle increases, rate of diffusion decreases. Mass of particle. As the mass of particle increases, the rate of diffusion decreases. Types of diffusion. Diffusion is a critical biological process in which molecules and compounds tend to spread out evenly in solutions, that is both liquid and gaseous. Diffusion is a passive way for molecules to enter or exit a cell requiring no energy. Animal cells such as our own need to exchange materials with bodily fluids such as blood, but the cell membrane stands in the way. Even in the presence of the barrier, cells can use two types of diffusion to accomplish membrane transport. Passive diffusion. Passive diffusion is the movement of molecules across a semipermeable membrane without the help of protein channels. Cell membranes are made up of a phospholipid bilayer that has a non-polar hydrophobic or water-fearing middle layer that is protected on both sides by polar hydrophilic or water-loving surfaces. Hydrophobic molecules can freely pass through a cell membrane. Examples are gases such as oxygen, carbon dioxide and nitrogen. Large polar molecules or electrically charged molecules cannot freely pass through a cell membrane. Facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is the flow of molecules down a concentration gradient across a membrane but requires the help of a protein. There are two categories of proteins that assist facilitated diffusion: carrier proteins and channel proteins. Carrier proteins are like taxicabs in a cell membrane. They shuttle molecules from one side of the membrane to the other. Channel proteins are like tunnels that create a hole across a cell membrane. Channels open to allow molecules to flow through them. Facilitated diffusion involves proteins, but those proteins do not require the use of energy molecule, that is ATP. Some major examples of diffusion in biology: gas exchange at the alveoli, oxygen from air to blood, carbon dioxide from blood to air, gas exchange for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide from air to leaf, oxygen from leaf to air, gas exchange for respiration, oxygen from blood to tissue cells, carbon dioxide in opposite direction. Transfer of transmitter substances: acetylcholine from presynaptic to postsynaptic membrane at a synapse. Examples of diffusion: the fragrance from an open bottle of perfume reaches us by the process of diffusion. The molecules of perfumes diffuse through the molecules of air. Similarly, when we put sugar in a liquid, the sugar molecules diffuse throughout the liquid, giving it a uniformly sweet taste. Thus, the medium of diffusion may be gas or liquid. Example of diffusion in plant cells: in order to carry out photosynthesis, a plant requires carbon dioxide. On the underside of leaves, there are small holes known as stomata. Carbon dioxide diffused into the leaves via these. Leaves produce oxygen and water vapor, and these in turn diffuse out via the stomata. Example of diffusion in an animal cell: the cells in our body need glucose and oxygen for respiration. Both these are carried into the blood. When blood reaches the cells, the molecules of glucose and oxygen diffuse out of the blood and into the cells. As cells use up the glucose and oxygen, they produce waste chemicals and carbon dioxide. If these were to build up in the cells, they would poison them. Therefore, they diffused out of the cells into the blood. Experiments to show diffusion. Number 1. Experiments to show diffusion of liquid in liquid. If a drop of ink is added to a glass or jar of water, will diffuse through water until all of the water is colored. First pour water into a jar and let it sit until all movements of water has stopped. Add a drop of ink at a time so we can see the drop of color slowly spread out throughout the water. Number 2. Experiment to show diffusion of liquid in liquid through a membrane. Here we use paper towels as a permeable membrane to demonstrate that small molecules can diffuse across a barrier from one liquid to another. Fill a jar with water and cover the opening with a paper towel in such a way that the center of the paper towel hangs down into the water. Put food coloring into the water that fills the paper towel and observe as the color diffuses through the barrier. Number 3. Experiment shows diffusion of solids in liquid. Here we place colorless crystals of lead nitrate and potassium iodide at opposite sides of a petri dish of deionized water. As they dissolve and diffuse towards each other, they form clouds of yellow lead iodide. Materials required: petri dish, forceps, piece of white paper, lead nitrate, potassium iodide, deionized water. Method: place a petri dish on a white tile or piece of white paper. Fill it nearly to the top with deionized water. Using forceps, place a crystal of lead nitrate at one side of the petri dish and a crystal of potassium iodide at the other. Observe as the crystals begin to dissolve and a new compound is formed between them. The lead nitrate and potassium iodide each dissolve and begin to diffuse through the water. When the lead ions and iodide ions meet, they react to form solid yellow lead iodide, which precipitates out of solution. The reaction looks like this. Lead nitrate plus potassium iodide give rise to lead iodide plus potassium nitrate. The precipitate does not form exactly between the two crystals. This is because the lead ion is heavier and diffuses more slowly through the liquid than the iodide ion. Experiment 4. To study diffusion when copper sulphate is brought in contact with water, that is liquid. Materials required: copper sulphate crystals, 100 ml beaker, measuring cylinder, water. Procedure: take about 2 gram of copper sulphate crystals in 100 ml beaker. Add about 50 ml of water and allow it to stand for few minutes. Note the development of blue color in water. Conclusion: when solids such as copper sulfate, potassium permanganate are brought in contact with liquids such as water, intermixing of substances, that is, diffusion takes place. Summary: at the end, to conclude, diffusion means the movement of gases, liquids or solids, that is, molecules, atoms or ions, from a point of its higher concentration to a point of its lower concentration in order to get evenly distributed throughout the available space. Diffusion of gases and other molecules across membranes in our bodies allows many biological processes to occur and thus keeps us alive by providing oxygen and energy sources to our cells. This practical described different types of diffusion, that is passive and facilitated diffusion. It is further followed by note on examples of diffusion. Further, we mentioned practical demonstration for diffusion in various mediums. Thank you.